Hello, gorgeous.
Hello, Simone. So, this is the subject that I particularly find interesting. And a lot of people are surprised. They're like, why are you interested in obscure paraphilias, which are more commonly known in the public as fetishes?
Mhm.
And the answer is because it tells us a lot about human neurology, human evolutionary conditions, and the way humans think more broadly. And people might be like, wait, what do you mean by that? Right? So if you see an impulse that exists across a broad breadth of the human population, but doesn't appear like it would have been selected for in an evolutionary context, like it wouldn't have increased the number of surviving offspring they had,
Mhm.
you have found one of two things. Either you have shown that you misunderstand the environmental context that humanity evolved in, and that something that seems like it would have been a maladaptive behavior was actually a positive behavior, which is very interesting if you
Mhm.
find that. But then the other thing that you may have found is you have found a way that the brain essentially breaks, or a pathway doesn't work correctly, but doesn't work correctly in a way that happens over and over and over again in different humans, which tells you something about, like, if trains keep flying onto a road at a certain point, you can tell broadly, at least in one area, where a train track is likely supposed to be,
Mm.
and like the speed of trains on that train tracks and where trains are turning on that train track. Now, this becomes especially interesting in the world of fetishes and paraphilias, because this is a very common area where you see something that is very clearly a hard-coded biological instinct in individuals cross-culturally.
Would you like to know more?
People will say, oh no, well, this is all like modern internet stuff that's causing this, and we'll get into that argument in a second. Well, I can get into it right now. It's just very obviously not. If you look in a historic context, most of the paraphilias you see today, like sadism and stuff like that, you're going to see in like the Marquis de Sade, for example, which was definitely in a pre-internet context, or you see in the British Vice, which was so common a fetish among British people, they called it the British Vice, which was men who liked being spanked by paddles by women. Here is James Joyce writing about farts. Big fat fellows, long windy ones, quick little merry cracks, and a lot of tiny little naughty farties, ending in a large gush from your hole. I think I could pick hers out in a roomful of farting women. It is a rather girlish noise, not like the wet windy fart, which I imagine fat wives have. It is sudden and dry and dirty, like a bold girl would let off in fun in a school dormitory at night. I hope Nora will let off no end of her farts in my face, so that I may know their smell also. So people will be like, oh, yeah, weird stuff like farting porn. That's like from weird Brazilian fart. No, this was around at the time of James Joyce. So if you see a fetish today that is common, you will almost always see it in a historic context. And today we are going to discuss the concept of monster girls, because
Mm.
monster girls and monster boys are something that you see pretty frequently in pornography and hentai. However, it is also something that like doesn't really make sense from an evolutionary context.
Yeah.
Why would you be attracted to something that's not human? And a person can go, oh, come on, this doesn't appear in historic stuff. And I'm like, are you not familiar with your Greek myth?
Yeah,
How
seriously.
if you talk about like the plurality of sex that happens in Greek myths,
The swans, the cows,
I would say like a good or various monstrous
the
creatures, or
light. Mhm.
yeah, or people are like, well, but it didn't happen in the medieval period, and I'm like, you are clearly not familiar with medieval fairy tales or medieval sort of folk horrors. You know, it was actually
Folk whores?
folk horrors.
Oh, okay.
Incubuses,
Sorry. I was
succubuses,
like,
stuff
that's
like that,
funny.
they didn't look like humans. They'd have, like, various animal body parts and stuff like that, and
Mm.
people will be like, "Okay, well, how common is this stuff really?" So if you look at, like,
Oh,
the
yeah, like the
statistic.
folklore, like marrying a mermaid and a seal woman or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, so when we did stats on this, vampires, 21% of females consume erotic content tied to this, 7% of males, werewolves, 14% of females, 2% of males, an android, 7% of females, 8% of males, an alien, 13% of females, 8% of males, a dwarf, the fictional race, 8% of females, 7% of males, a dwarf, the fictional race, 2% of females, 8% of males, goo people, 2% of females, 4% of
It's a
males,
deep cut.
furries, 5% of each, half human, half animals, 7% females, 4% males. You know,
7%. I mean, wow.
yeah,
Are we
so
talking half like a horse? What are they called? Horsemen? Where half of them is a
yeah,
horse?
so if you're like, "Oh, well,
Centaur.
that's a small number." Well, if you contrast those numbers with the numbers who, for example, consume erotic content with 2 men having sex,
Okay.
that's 21% of females and 7% of males. So, it's about as common as watching, for example, gay
Yaoi.
male porn, some
It's
of this stuff.
just I don't know, like, there in this we should probably someday do a whole deep dive on the genre of yaoi in Japan too, and how it's
Yaoi is
spread.
boy love
Boy on
stuff,
boy, yeah.
which is, and you can see what I think would surprise people is the majority of people consuming man-on-man porn are women
And yeah.
by more than double.
This is both straight and lesbian identifying women. Of course, we argue that women don't really exist on the Kinsey scale, they exist on a dominant submission scale. But
But people can look at our
yeah.
book on sexuality if they want to read more on this. But this brings us back to the question of monster women,
Mm,
right?
okay.
What could be causing this? So you can come up with a few hypotheses. Maybe this was about, and this is sort of how science is done, right? Like if people are like, how do you do sort of gentleman science in your book? So you could say, well, maybe it's correlated with like a village was raided or something like that. And so
Okay.
you would see the raiders as monstrous, but need to be attracted to them to be able to survive the raid. Right. And it's like, well, if that's the case, then you are likely to see two things. One is a cross correlation between this and masochism. And this is more prominent
Amen.
dramatically in females than
But
males.
this does not explain, therefore, monster girls.
Well, no, it could explain, but the problem is that if monster boys were more common than monster girls, this would explain that.
Exactly.
The problem is that that's not what you see outside of something like vampires, but vampires don't really look particularly different from humans, and so they probably falls more into just pure dominant submission
Dominant, yeah.
stuff,
Yeah, it's the right
which
thing.
then would fit into this system, but you don't see the cross correlation between these attractiveness and other attractiveness. So then you're like, okay, 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 great. Back to the drawing board. Well, let's look at some other things that appear where a human appears to have non-human body proportions. Okay.
Oh, like really tiny women and really big women?
Really tiny women, or it could be women with giant breasts.
Disproportionate, yeah.
So let's see if I can find that on the chart here. Okay, so a good example here would be a giant penis longer than 2 feet, 7% of women, 4% of men.
Ugh.
Giant breasts larger than a quarter of total body weight, 4% of women and 17% of men. So
Wait, so normally I'm 125, so what's a Jesus! That's a lot!
these are impossible for a normal human to have.
Ugh, well,
They
no,
are
I mean, some
either
people have gotten plastic surgery to do it.
surgically implanted, but they don't, when women have that, they do not look human, they look deformed
Yeah.
to a normal person. But
Oh, yeah.
17% of men are still consuming this content. So what, or you could say people who are, amputees and stuff like that, or in some other way don't look like a normal human would
But
look.
around that, didn't you argue in the book that this is more of a super stimulus thing?
We'll
You should
get to
probably
that
define super
concept. We'll
stimuli.
get that concept in a second. I'm just
Okay.
describing hypotheses here.
Okay, okay.
So you actually do find a cross correlation here. And we didn't just find this cross correlation in our data. When Ayla ran the stats with a completely different uh, data pool, she also found this cross correlation here. So this verifies this hypothesis that there is something where some humans have a looser bound on the human form when they find it attractive. So let's talk about how this could work and how we can verify if this is the way that it's working.
Okay.
So super stimuli are a very important concept when you are studying sexuality, okay? So a super stimuli is like if you have a bird that evolved to sit on blue eggs, but there were never like giant blue rocks around its evolutionary environment, it never had a pressure to not sit on something that was larger than its normal blue eggs or bluer than its normal blue eggs. And so if you put a giant blue rock next to it, it will always choose the rock over its own eggs. This is just a very common thing you see throughout evolutionary biology, and it like makes sense as to why this would be a thing.
Yeah.
Um,
If X is good, X squared is better.
X squared is better. Yeah.
Yeah.
So with human sexual drives, well, males and females are both to an extent attracted to the average. Like if you were going to like pre-code them to breed with a thing that is likely to lead to offspring, you would pre-code them with look for the things that gender differentiate males and females, and then target individuals who appear to have these traits. These would be secondary sex characteristics. So with women, these would be breasts, butt, hips. With men, this would be height, the male
Muscling arms,
stature,
triangle
muscle
shape.
mass,
Yeah.
yeah, etc. So, and you do in a deep voice, and you do see an attraction to these traits. But what is more interesting is we didn't have super stimuli of these traits in our evolutionary environment.
Mhm.
We did not have women with supernormally large breasts in our evolutionary environment.
Well, I mean, unless they were, some genetic
Or
abnormality.
diseased in some way or something like that,
Yeah.
right, but what I'm saying is that it just didn't appear that much. There was not an evolutionary, reason for anyone within the population to evolve disgust to that trait.
Ah,
Even
right.
though I and most men actually do reflexively feel disgust when they see a woman who looks non-human for her gender dimorphic anatomy. Even something as I think some people would consider as small as like Caitlyn, or what's her name? The Caitlyn Jenner's family member who has a giant butt.
No, they've reduced that. Big butts are out, heroin chic is back in. But yeah,
What
Kim
whatever.
Kardashian.
If Kardashian, like I find her quite repulsive. Like at a visceral level, I find her repulsive.
But
I
don't you think that's cultural? Because you go to Miami, you see giant asses and women wearing ass padding underwear to try to
No,
create the Brazilian butt
culture
lift look.
affects what you find attractive much less than you would think. I
Well,
could
then
go into
why
the
is there
studies
so
on
much
this.
difference between the body type that you see pervasive among higher status women or we'll say image conscious women in Miami versus Los Angeles
This
versus New
appears
York?
to be an evolutionary thing. Well, okay, so I guess I can get into this because we do go into this in our books. The core thing that differentiates. So with men, you're going to be attracted to. There's sort of two ideal feminine traits that you
Mhm.
could be attracted to.
Youth or female dimorphism.
Yes, you could be optimizing for fertility window, or you could be optimizing for. I'm absolutely certain this is a woman.
Can
These
never be too
two
careful.
Well, these 2 sets of optimization functions actually require you to optimize around different traits,
Yeah.
because the traits that are associated with youth in women are smaller breasts and a smaller butt. So you are actually optimizing for almost the exact opposite thing. So who optimizes within a monogamous culture for fertility windows over ensuring that the person is a woman? It is somebody with access to high resources. And behold, in our data, we see this. And it's a huge difference. We have a video where we go over this in more detail, but it's like 10-fold or 20-fold increase in liking this, flat justice body type for wealthy men versus the poorest groups of men.
It's
But you also see this just, I mean, if you're looking, like, you don't see people like, Elon or Bill Gates or something like that dating these women who look like super, super, super feminine. Instead, the women that you see them dating are often very well,
more androgynous looking because they look
more
so young.
androgynous looking, yeah. Whereas when you see wealthy men date these women, they are wealthy men who appear to have an extreme level of status anxiety,
Mm.
which shows that, like, biologically, they don't see themselves as wealthy. Trump would be a good example of this. If you look at the way that he accessorizes and the lifestyle he lives in, when he's been to Mar-a-Lago or something like that, there is clearly a fairly large level of status anxiety there, which is likely driving his reproductive choices that make his reproductive choices much more similar to a lower economic status
Which
individual.
ultimately made him a man of the people. He's a poor man's idea of a rich man, even in his own mind, because of that anxiety.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So that's why you're getting that, okay? But
Mhm.
let's go back to, and by the way, you can look at cross-cultural,
Oh, shit! Okay, so you're saying you're saying that big asses are a thing in Miami because they're poor,
well, because they're
and
poor and there's more status anxiety. Where
yeah,
you see these giant butts, where do you see them? In the highest status anxiety environments in the world,
that's
Miami and LA.
that's interesting.
And also why I think you see the PDA, the PDA files appear disproportionately was in elite circles. There actually is a higher rate of PDA files in those communities. But now back to Monster Girls.
Well,
So humans appear to have a secondary system that overlaps their attraction system that's meant to prevent them from having sex with non-human things that are non-efficacious in terms of sex with them, could lead to diseases and blah blah blah, right? So how do they determine non-human things? It's likely that there is a level of innate disgust that your average programmed human has to things that look sufficiently different from the average human form. And this is why your average human has a level of disgust to things like bestiality, to things like you know, um, extreme breast size and stuff like that. However,
you could call it deformity.
yeah, you can call it deformity. Well, it appears that certain ways of altering a body do not count or do not trigger this instinct in a large portion of the population. So first, let's talk about the huge chunk of the population, which is a fairly big chunk, that does not appear to have this disgust reaction.
The boob guys.
17% of men who are still into enormously large boobs, or what was
Yeah.
it, women penises over 2 feet.
That
That
I
was
don't understand. Okay, yeah.
7% of women. Okay.
Ooh.
So if you have 100 women, 7 of them will have consumed erotic material that consume this, that portray this. So what's going on in these individuals? Well, if you have any of these systems, in the same way that our predominant arousal system sometimes breaks, right? Like sometimes men are predominantly aroused by male characteristics in their partners, i.e., gay people. Sometimes women are aroused by female characteristics in their partners. Like clearly evolution wasn't strongly sorting for this. You're just getting a broken system. Sometimes individuals, you see get turned on by feces, right? Like this is clearly something that's meant to create in an evolutionary context a disgust reaction. So what it means is there's 2 ways this disgust system can break. One is it just doesn't activate at all. These are the individuals who I think are mostly into generally large, but not monstrously large breasts, or generally large, like the 2-foot penis and stuff like that, right? Like these are individuals who are interested in something that is outside the normal bounds, but isn't like specifically stimulating the system. Then there's another thing that appears to happen in arousal patterns, which is that arousal and disgust get flipped, because we argue in great detail in our book that arousal and disgust are actually the same system. When you are aroused by something, your eyes dilate, you breathe in, you look at it longer, you want to get closer to it. When you are disgusted by something, your pupils contrast, you hold your nose or you hold your breath to not smell, and you instinctively look away and try to get away from the thing. It's just the same system with a negative modifier. And anything that causes an innate disgust within some portion of the population will be a fetish for some other percent of the population. And people are like, well, everything's a fetish. No, that is not true. That is just patently wrong. If you take things that don't cause disgust but are tied to other innate human impulses, like a fear of heights or a fear of fire, for example, there is not a community, or at least a large community, consummate with the insects or poo or farts tied to something like fire arousal or falling from high locations arousal. So it's not just like all of your systems can break in this way. It is one system.
Right.
And it's the same with arousal patterns. Pretty much anything that can arouse a population is going to disgust a subset of that population. Well, you can also get an inverse system where the thing that's supposed to identify things that look inhuman ends up accidentally arousing a small portion of the population instead of disgusting them. And this is what I think leads to full-on bestiality and stuff like that.
Mm.
But then there's a second category here, which I would call like the cat girl phenomenon.
The cat girl and monster girl in this world?
No, not exactly. I think it's arousing a different system, because
Yeah.
that what I mean is if you look at the popularity of this stuff in anime.
Mhm.
So I would categorize there are a few anatomical differences which do not appear to trigger the this is inhuman, I now generate disgust.
Fluffy ears
Um
and tail are just cute. Not
so yeah, there's a few that don't appear to broadly generate this. Now in some humans they do, but broadly. Sharp teeth don't appear to. The vampire thing is really,
sharp
really
teeth.
big in the population.
Yes, especially if it's just the canines.
Yes, different colored eyes, different shaped
Yeah,
eyes don't
yeah,
appear to trigger this.
fair.
Different colored hair doesn't appear to trigger this. So
Totally.
hair that is like anime hair. Let's go there, okay? Another thing that doesn't appear to trigger it is small cosmetic modifications such as tail, ear differences. Those sorts of things don't seem to broadly trigger this.
A great example here would be elf ears slash Vulcan ears on girls. I have seen so many guys thirst after elf slash Vulcan girls.
And then another one that's really interesting if you're going to stretch is broadly if you're dealing with a biped with breasts or a T-shaped male figure like human, female, male, human secondary sex characteristics for either males or females.
Mhm.
For a large but smaller portion of the population, this also doesn't seem to trigger this
So
monster girl.
basically furry fursonas.
Well, not personas, I think goes a little far. Here I'm thinking more like Lola Bunny, for example.
Oh,
You know,
okay, okay.
this is something that I think is broadly like if someone's like, I thought Lola Bunny was hot, like you're not going to get a lot of people being like, yeah, Lola Bunny was not hot at all.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, yeah, that was clearly sexualized and meant or designed to be an arousing character. So why wasn't it triggering these? Here we're going back to evolution again.
Okay.
Um, because we can actually see the genetic results of this arousal pattern being mainstream within specific populations. So if you look at regions of the world where you have a high degree of mate selection, either because there were periods where all the women died pretty frequently, or even more common when all of the men died pretty frequently, but you see this in either area, you begin to get the evolution of monstrous traits that you do not see in default human populations.
Oh,
Would you
what, just
like?
because of inbreeding?
No, because people tend to select for people with extremely novel traits. In a society with no cat girls, this shows that the cat girl might be considered uniquely attractive. In a society where nobody had like naturally occurring pink eyes or something like that, the one individual with pink eyes or skin or something like that might be considered uniquely attractive. Um,
Okay.
and you can say, what are you talking about? These monstrous traits that appear almost nowhere in human populations, except for areas that
Yeah.
underwent very strict genetic selection over a long period of time. Well, the reason you don't notice them is the populations that had them have dominated the globe.
Oh, like redheads or something?
Redheads exist almost nowhere outside of extremely cold regions where
Yeah.
you had in fact, not just redheads, any human hair color but black is incredibly rare if you're talking about the broad initial ethno groups that would have existed in the world that like would have evolved out of the initial human sample size and you go back 1,000 years ago. The
Yeah.
populations that had non-black hair only lived really in Arctic regions or
Yeah, and the world
extremely
also is a
extreme
lot colder,
environments.
to your point. Yeah,
Another trait is, and they're like, what are you talking about? Pink eyes. No one would select that. You are forgetting
very
that
nice.
all eyes other than brown eyes are actually an incredibly rare trait if you go 1,000 years ago and only really existed in Arctic environments where you had extreme levels of mate selection. And then people are like, well, different skin colors. Gingers basically have a unique skin tone with their extreme level of freckling. This would have been considered if you took one of them and put them in ancient Rome, they would not be particularly dissimilar to an ancient Roman than to us, a person with pronounced canines would look, or a person with cat ears, or a
In
person
terms
with
of
no
that
tail would look.
subtle standing out. Still human,
It,
but different human.
yeah, a subtle but standing out actually wins the genetic lottery when you are dealing with a really high level of sexual selection, determining which genes win and which genes lose. So we do actually have real monster girls among us. They are called gingers.
Oh my God. Or women with green eyes or blue eyes or
Yeah.
possibly blondes too.
So what
Natural
are
blondes.
your thoughts on
So
all of this?
the Dallas blonde, which is classically a woman who's not naturally blonde, they dye their hair blonde, is essentially trying to be a monster girl.
Well, no. I mean, I'd even say more than that. The girl who dyes her hair blue or something like that in order to appear unique and quirky is a modern version of this.
Uh-huh.
And if people are like, come on, sexual selection, selecting for non-human like traits in an individual or slightly non-human like traits, even in environments where they didn't evolve this, they adopted this culturally. Think about
Yeah.
the many African tribes that adopted rituals which turned their body into slightly non-human,
Oh, like elongated necks or
giant
ear
loop
gauges.
earrings or giant things in
Yeah.
their cheeks. Now, when I see these women, I actually get the same form of disgust that I would get from looking at an actual monster, like something that is genuinely non-human. So I assume that they likely co-evolved with a damped down form of that repulsion selection in their cultural groups, which could mean that if you were to do studies on these populations, you would find much more attractive to things that like monster girl type pornography.
That
Um,
is fascinating. I really like this hot take.
well, and here it gets more interesting. Okay, so if you look at cultures that deviate from normal human forms, think golden lotuses, for example.
Oh, you
Here,
mean like Chinese foot
foot
binding?
binding, yeah. Here you see this in a culture that valued extreme levels of femininity, and
Mhm.
what you have there is a gender dimorphic trait, foot size, that is being created at an extreme level,
Yeah,
like
some
it was in
women having extreme plastic surgery to have large breasts.
yes,
Finding's
yes,
just another version of that
yeah.
from childhood
Uh,
with intense pain. I guess also having large breasts is probably intensely painful. Wow.
uh,
Yikes.
well, and so this is all the people are like, why does all of this matter from human? Well, when you understand things like that, what arouses you is based on gated metrics with a disgust and arousal system that are likely the same system, which work within certain windows. One, you can better control your own involuntary arousal pathways by
Yes.
contextualizing them as what they are, random switches in your head at birth. When you contextualize them as like weird addictions and stuff like that due to things you were exposed to on the internet, then you relate to them as an addiction. And the thing is people rarely win against addictions.
Yeah.
When you relate to them as just a standard like switch thing that happened at birth, then you can more easily be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to choose to ignore that, like other things I choose to ignore that I like. For example, when I am around a friend or something like that and they have a hot wife, like I am pre-evolved to want to sleep with or hit on their wife, but I choose not to hit on them. I don't view that as like an addiction or something. I'm just like, yeah, I choose not to find that person arousing. I choose not to hit on them. When you understand these systems and contextualize them for what they really are, it's much easier to not have them influence you. And so if you have any paraphilias, which most people have, if people are like, oh, that person has a fetish, how weird. I'm like, actually, if you look at the data, if you have no fetishes, you are the weird one. You are in a
Mhm.
vast minority. I can't remember if there was like 8% of people have like no fetishes at all in our data set. Like, you are the weirdo if you have no fetish. It is not the people with a fetish who are weird.
Which I just want to clarify, because anyone looking at Ayla's stats is going to see that vanilla stuff is obviously the most popular. You very well are probably going to be aroused by it most of the vanilla stuff and then also have these fetishes just
Yeah,
because.
no specific fetish is weird, but
Yeah.
understanding how these work, and we could do other videos, and we've done some videos in our early videos if you've only watched our recent podcast, because, we went over some of our theories from our sexuality book and more recent stuff. I mean, and some of the early stuff that we did, you can get a deeper dive on some of these topics. But knowing about this doesn't just help you, but also being able to teach your kids about how human sexuality actually works prevents them from contextualizing things that they don't have control over as either shameful or worse than that. Because if it's shameful, then they hide it, overindulge in it. You see this in the statistics. When people think a portion of their sexuality is shameful, they actually indulge in it more than when they don't.
Yeah.
But worse than that, they think it's something they can't talk to their parents about. So they see themselves as discriminated for it, and then they begin to contextualize it as part of their identity.
Yeah.
The very most dangerous thing is that your kids grow up not understanding how human sexuality works, and then they begin to categorize some paraphilia they have as a portion of their identity, and then their core identity becomes something like for furry or whatever, right?
Yeah, way worse. I mean, yeah, there are very high profile examples of religiously very conservative families having certain members do terrible things, probably because they weren't, yeah, given context, given a way to understand what they felt and what they were tempted to do. So they just,
Exactly.
oh boy, yeah, yeah,
Well, truth is the purifying light that burns away our genetic scars in pre-programming. When you study this stuff, knowledge burns away temptation and sin more than hiding from something. When you hide from something, when you make it magic or addiction or something like that, you give it power. When you say it just is what it is, a genetic scar, crossed wires, it is much easier to work around than when
yeah,
you don't.
yeah,
Well, and this stuff can become a huge problem if you miscontextualize it and somebody happens to have one of the really damaging one of these,
yeah.
like the sadists who think that sadism is actually a part of their personality, or the
Mm,
PDA files who think that that is actually a core aspect of their identity. And then that leads to incredibly immoral action.
yeah, yeah. It's, yeah. I'm really glad that, I mean, we've already ruined sex for our kids, thank goodness, because we talk about it way too openly and they're going to hate that. And so they're probably going to be virgins until their mid 20s. But
I
I'm
don't mind if
glad.
they're virgins their whole life if they want to be, so long as they have kids that are genetically theirs.
Yeah. for for non-sex negative people, we're so surprisingly not
We're pretty
sex
sex
positive.
negative. We are we are open to sexual investigation, but I would think most people reading our book would say, I say objectively, human sexuality is pretty disgusting.
Yeah.
Even vanilla straight sexuality, people are like, no, in a loving marriage, it's like, no, it's
Yeah.
not. It's
No,
gross.
just the sounds of sex.
If you removed your pre-coded addiction to like pre-coded predilection for these behaviors, and you think about them like you think about
In
anything else,
isolation. Yeah, then it's
yeah,
like,
these are like oozing organs, like
yeah. But I mean also when you think about other very basic human functions like eating and you think
But I
about
think when you
masticating and digesting food, it's
contextualize it in that context, it also helps you understand that, this is just sort of a pre-coded thing into you, but it doesn't define who you are. It's an
yeah.
accident of your evolution.
Well, and similar to eating, right? It's we have a language and we have a means of explaining to people that you may really like this one type of food, but it's not good for you. And that doesn't define you. You're not a whatever type of food person.
Yeah.
Whereas with sexuality, unfortunately, it has been turned into this identity thing, which just seems to even worse now. So,
Yeah.
oh well.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was fascinating, Malcolm. I'm so glad because I didn't know what we were getting into with this. I was like, Monster Girls, where are we going to go here? But man, we went down a lot
I
of
was
fun
listening
rabbit
to the
holes.
Monster Girl rap, which I'll play after this, and we should go check out the guy who makes the videos, because we added one after the Tomboy Apocalypse video, one of his songs, which is also fun. But yeah, I absolutely love you, Simone, and I am so honored to be married to you because you are my fetish.
I'm gay for you, Malcolm. I don't know why it is that I find you sexy and nothing else, but I'm glad we found each other. We're weirdly compatible. That's great. All right.
All right, guys, have a wonderful day. And remember, the things that arouse you and your gender are not your identity. They are accidents of evolution. Over focusing on them in terms of your identity will lead to immoral behavior. And if you end up over focusing on them with your children, it makes them very susceptible to gender and sexuality cults. And a lot of cults use sexuality, even sexual shame. I mean, this is how the 8-passenger situation started, really, was this woman who started it, who roped in the mom, that had a thing where basically she kept trying to brainwash people by convincing them they had porn addictions.
Yeah, and by porn addiction, it was like you've looked at porn.
You've looked at porn, yeah.
Which, welcome to humanity. I don't know what kind of world she came from, but
Well, I think that she learned that she could use that on any man because she was from Mormon culture. And so
yeah.
when she was trying to get something over on them, she could broadly assume that any man, even if they're Mormon, has consumed some amount of porn. And then just say, I know you're a sinner, even if you don't know you're a sinner, and all your behavior comes from porn. And therefore, then use that to build like a knowledge hierarchy over them, which
Well,
then
and a wedge
see.
specifically between
Yeah.
them and their wives, which is
Yeah.
terrifying.
All right. Love you, Simone.
I love you too.